Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Exploring Faith, Pursuing Grace. My name is Daniel Rogers, and I'm joined today by Scott McKnight, an author that I know a lot of you appreciate. You've messaged me about several of his books in the past, and he is here today to talk about a book that he has written called The Invisible Jesus. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks, Daniel. Thank you for having me on, and I'm glad to be with you digitally in Alabama.
Yes,
I hope your
welcome.
football team starts doing better.
Well, it depends on which one you're talking about.
University, yeah, the
Oh, the University of
university,
Alabama. Yeah.
yeah,
I know that loss to Vanderbilt was shocking to a lot of folks in
yeah,
this area.
yeah.
But to some of us, it was like Christmas. So,
So you
for
don't
us
cheer
Auburn
for
fans.
Alabama. You're not
No,
Crimson Tide.
we're an Auburn Tiger family.
Oh, okay, all right.
Actually, before I went into ministry, I had done 2 years at Auburn for biosystems engineering. And then I stopped answering my parents' call from my life and started answering God's call from my life and went into full-time ministry. So
Very good.
it was,
Very good.
yes, sir. But I'm glad you're here, my friend. And the full title of your book is Invisible Jesus, a book about leaving the church and looking for Christ. Before we get started, I'd love to hear your own story, because I know you're writing from experience in this book. So why don't
Mm-hmm.
you walk us through a little bit about yourself and your background and your own path in what is popularly been called deconstruction?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Deconstruction, as it is being used today, is not the technical understanding from Jacques Derrida and the French deconstructionists, but is more about shedding something that somebody does no longer believes. Let's say they decide to shed some of the doctrines. Well, I grew up in American fundamentalist conservative Baptist church land.
Okay.
I think my church that I grew up in were good people. I don't think that they were mean spirited, but they were very conservative on many ideas. My mom and dad were conservative. So, we didn't I never went to high school prom, uh, didn't go to dances. Those were considered evil.
Hmm.
We believed in the rapture pretty strenuously. Our pastor preached straight from the Bible, uh, verse by verse, sort of expression by expression. And we just had a lot of ideas like this. And it's pretty predictable what we believe. Of course, we believe the standard ideas that are in the church.
Sure.
I never heard of the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. Those were things that mainline churches and Catholic churches recited. We didn't do that sort of thing, but we had a statement of faith, and it was based on the Nicene Creed, of course. When I went to college, it was the first time in my life that I began to wonder if maybe what I had been taught needed to be revised.
Hmm.
And a flashpoint for me, oddly enough, was the rapture question. This was in the early 1970s. I graduated from college in 1976. And I was in college in Grand Rapids at a fundamentalist college. I was playing basketball on the basketball team and studying the Bible, which was far more important to me than playing basketball. But a book came out from Zondervan by a man named Robert H. Gundry, and I had never heard. I didn't know a lot of these names. I knew people connected to dispensationalism, and so I read his book called The Church. Let's see, I don't know, The Church in the Tribulation. Maybe was the title of it. I don't have it anymore, but he persuaded me, even though I had some pushback in the book. He persuaded me of a post-trib rapture.
Hmm.
And I thought, this is what the Bible teaches, far closer than dispensationalism. I was fortunate to have a professor who really believed he wanted us to think for ourselves. And he just opened the Bible and asked us to interpret the Bible for ourselves. Well, at first you're a big collection and bag full of nonsense. But over a while, the more you read the Bible, which I was reading carefully every day, the more you begin to pick things up. And before long, I felt like I could develop a pretty decent biblical theology. And my teacher, Dr. Joe Crawford, was helpful for that. But I'm reading Gundry, and I became convinced of a post-trib rapture. And I discover that there's a lot of people around me that think I'm a liberal because I believe this. And I'm thinking, this isn't what liberalism is. But I began to feel all sorts of funny things, like I'm not accepted in this community. Where would I find a community? This is what the Bible says. I can't teach this at church without getting in trouble. Who else can I read? So I read George Ladd. He's post-trib. And then I read George Ladd's Theology of the New Testament when it came out. Well, I think I was a junior probably. And it confirmed this. And by the time I went to seminary, I had shed a lot of ideas connected to fundamentalism, because almost like it was a breakthrough. Now, another breakthrough for me was Francis Schaeffer. You probably don't even know who he is.
I'm familiar with Francis Schaeffer.
Okay. Francis Schaeffer wrote a series of small books with InterVarsity, I believe. Maybe it was Tyndale. And they were calling into question the American church and the church's integrity. And I was reading him and thinking, I had become a critic of the church. And by the time I got to seminary, I think a good way of describing my faith is I knew a lot more about what I didn't believe than what I did believe.
Oh, yeah.
It was in seminary that I took a course on the Synoptic Gospels with Walter Liefeld. And in a sense, I discovered my life passion as an academic and my personal passion as a Christian. And that was Jesus in the Gospels as it is presented. And over the next decade, 4 or 5 years in seminary, let's see, I started in 76 and I moved to England in 81. And then I did my doctorate at the University of Nottingham on the Gospel of Matthew and came back and started teaching. By the time I was teaching, I was beginning to construct my own faith pretty diligently on the basis of Jesus, the kingdom, the Synoptic Gospels more than the Gospel of John. And it has been that phase of deconstruction leading to reconstruction on the basis of Jesus that led me to work with Tommy Phillips to write the book Invisible Jesus. Our subtitle is A Book About Leaving the Church and Looking for Christ. Now, we had all kinds of titles in this book.
I'll bet you
the
did.
original manuscript, we had about 10 different titles. But one of them was The Prophetic Voice of Deconstruction.
Well, this
and the editors thought that was too sophisticated or just too much, a mouthful, and nobody knows what some of these terms mean. But what we believe, Tommy and I have listened to people who've gone through experiences like ours, and we have said those people are coming to terms with the foundation of the Christian faith, the essence, the essentials. And so we did not think that they should be banned or criticized. Like there's a new book, I don't know who, I haven't read the book. Someone told me about it, about this criticizing the deconstructors. Yeah. And I'm sitting here thinking, I know a lot of deconstructors, and they have a really vibrant Christian faith. They just don't want to be in a fundamentalist church. They don't want to be in a progressive church. They want to be in a church that talks about Jesus, and they want to go to church to hear about Jesus, and they want to go to a church that is trying to live like Jesus. And this is not something to be banned. This is not something to be criticized. We think these people need to be heard.
And
Now,
there's
Daniel,
nothing.
that's a long answer to a simple question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. But there's nothing more effective than confirming these people's suspicions about whatever denominational background they may be deconstructing than to kick them out or to mark them
Yeah,
as heretics, in the midst of their questions. I mean, that's a
that's a
really good
good
way
point.
to get rid of them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of similarities between your background and my background. I was raised in a fundamentalist denomination as well. We pretend that we're not a denomination, of course, as most as
Well, so
most
was the Baptist church I grew up in. We weren't a
right.
denomination. We were an association, which is a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't have creeds, or we didn't talk about the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed unless we were criticizing the idea of creeds. Of course, we had no creed but Christ. But we did have the three P's: preaching schools, uh, celebrity preachers, and then publications. So anytime you got mad at somebody, you just started a new publication, and that was our way of having creeds.
What are your three P's?
Preaching schools. That's what we called
Preaching
seminaries. Yeah, we can't have
schools.
seminaries. Yes,
Yeah.
and then preachers, celebrity
Pre-
preachers, really, and then
yeah.
publications. So we, the Gospel Advocate, the Firm Foundation,
Yeah.
several papers that had split off of each other way back in the day.
Does anyone else use these three P's?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
I've not heard
I don't.
this. It's pretty clever.
Well, we move away from the term. I guess pastor would still work, but we typically don't use pastor to refer
Oh
to
yeah.
the pulpit minister because a pastor has very specific qualifications in First Timothy and Titus. But we have a few peculiarities like that. Our church background was not premillennialist, but we do share a lot of similarities, at least on the surface, with like the Plymouth Brethren, for instance. And so there's a lot of, I guess, across the fundamentalist denominations, there's a lot of similarities anyways, but we have a strong emphasis on baptism and on weekly communion, and a cappella music is another feature of ours.
Yeah.
But
Daniel, the experience of learning that something I was taught was not biblical was a profound experience. And it's not like it was anti-biblical. It was just sort of sub-biblical, filled with ideas that you can't find really in the Bible. Like what people think of I grew up with all kinds of stuff, very technical stuff about the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Well, this book, the book of Revelation never mentions an Antichrist. And the only time it appears in the New Testament is in 1 John. Well, 2 John has one reference. And there are many antichrists, it says. There's not one. So
yeah, that's right.
It's just when I learned things like this, I went, what in the world? What system? And so I became suspicious of the whole system and had to, in a sense, pick and choose which parts of the system survive scrutiny on the basis of the Bible. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that was another thing that was similar between your story and my own personal story, is that the beginning of my deconstruction was eschatology. I was questioning our eschatology, which our eschatology, it's starting to change now within the Churches of Christ, but it was really just, we don't know what this is, but we know it's not whatever the dispensationalists say. I mean, that was basically it.
I've heard that right there.
You have? Okay, good.
Yeah.
So whenever we tried to articulate, like I listened to one debate with one of our guys before, and the other guy in the debate kept calling him an amillennialist, and he said, "I don't even know what that means. Why do you keep calling me? I've never been called an amillennialist before." And I thought, man, this is just really revealing, how disconnected we are from many other Christians and this the theological world in general. But anyways, that I appreciated that similarity. And one of the other things that stood out to me that I think a lot of our listeners will resonate with is how you didn't know of any authors, even though they were extraordinarily popular authors, that were outside of your particular camp. That's how I was. I wouldn't have known Francis Schaeffer 5, 6, 7 years ago. And just to be honest with you, probably the reason why I know Francis Schaeffer is because of hearing about his son, Frank Schaeffer.
Frankie.
Yeah, that's right. I'd
Yeah.
seen some interviews with him a few years ago. But anyways, I appreciated a lot of that. One of the things that we have to do in the Church of Christ, and I'm going to bring this quote up from your book here, is if you tell someone that you're a member of the Church of Christ, they go, "Oh, so you're the ones who don't believe in music, and you think you're the only ones going to heaven." And so we're constantly having to go, "Well, we're not that Church of Christ. We're this particular brand." And you have this quote in your book that says, "Why identify as a Christian when you have to spend your time constantly telling people, but I'm not that kind of Christian." It was, I think, citing one of the people y'all had interviewed for the book. But I think that resonated a lot with me, and I think it would as well with the listeners. Can you talk a little bit about that idea? What are people, if they're not deconstructing the fundamentals of the Christian faith, what is it that they're rebelling against?
Well, not too long ago on my Substack, which is a new version of a blog for me. I know people call it a newsletter, but I don't know what I
Yeah,
call it. I guess because it's sent out as an email. Um,
yeah,
I kind of went through some of the main issues that people are deconstructing. And I sorted it out into things like politics and Christian nationalism, severe, strong alignment with the Republican Party, which, according to stats, is at about 80%. And though evangelicals like to say that mainliners are a bunch of Democrats, the truth is that mainline is about 50-50 on Democrats and Republicans. Um, and there's a lot of wealthy white Republicans in Presbyterian and Methodist and Episcopalian churches. Another issue was hypocrisy, hypocrisy in the church, hypocrisy of leaders. Another issue was sexuality. An increasing number of people of your generation, not my generation, are growing up with people who, I don't know what expression we want to use, have an alternative sexuality than the tradition. And a lot of these people are believers and pretty genuine in their Christian faith. And I'm not taking a stand right here on what's right or wrong about this. It's just that the wholesale exclusion of those who sense that they have a different sexuality has been a reason for some to leave these churches and find a church that's more amenable to what they believe. Another issue that we found was commitment to social justice, like economics.
sure.
I find a lot of, we hear a lot of the younger generation that will use the word capitalism as if it's a swear word. They are deeply concerned about racism in the United States. They all read Jamar Tisby's book. They read Ta-Nehisi Coates. They know about these issues with racism, and they believe in systemic racism, and they point this out in churches, and churches say, no, that's just not true. Well, they think it is, so they get to where they don't trust some of these leaders. There's a lot of them who are committed to ecology. In my experience,
Yeah,
they care about the environment, and they care about plastic in the Indian Ocean, and they care about the misuse of the natural resources that God has given us. The mentality of in and out and the doctrine of hell has been a really serious breakdown for a lot of people in the Christian faith, and they wonder if that's the proper way to speak about God and about the message of Jesus. Some of them are concerned about inerrancy. They read the Old Testament texts about war and attributed these to God, and they read the story about Jephthah in Judges, and they go, "Whoa, what is going on here? Is this what we believe to be what God wants for God's people?" People are concerned about creation science. They're concerned about dispensationalism. They're concerned about people telling them that watching Harry Potter is demonic or diabolical.
Right.
They're concerned about how people talk about original sin. These are the issues that people are deconstructing. They're shedding. Now, this is what's interesting to me. They're not all shedding all these things, but they're shedding some of these things. And it seems like when one falls, a couple more fall, and then they discover that they don't believe certain things that are important in their church, and they don't trust the pastor on some of the things he's talking about. And they're saying, this is my community, these are my friends, but they're not too keen on me anymore. Where can I go to church and find a place that is more amenable to my vision of what Jesus wants of his followers? And that's where they're gathering. And Tommy has his pulse on house churches in the United States. He seems to know all about this stuff, and he knows there's a lot of these people who are gathering in house churches rather than in traditional churches. But what is often said about deconstruction is that these people are getting rid of all the faith and they're walking away. And we got hold of a study, our publisher did, on people who used the term deconstruction for themselves. And they traced a pattern, and they found that 90% of them are still in church. A lot of them are still in the same church, but some of them, and I don't know the exact percentages, are in a different church that is more focused on Jesus. So that's sort of the elements that they're shedding as they're coming to terms with their own personal faith in Jesus Christ and their desire to follow him.
I love the tagline for your book here. Deconstructors are leaving church and looking for Christ. And that the first half of that line, deconstructors are leaving church, is usually all we hear. And we don't hear that 9 out of 10 of them end up either in a house church or some other expression of the faith that is more centered on Jesus than what they saw in one of the other churches.
I walked by a church sign this morning. It said, "Are you feeling disconnected? ? Try church again." And I said to my wife, I said, the deconstructors that we have looked at would say, no, church has been the problem. Try Jesus again. And that's a big theme that we found.
One of your quotes in your personal testimony in the book said, "Had I not gone through that deconstruction phase, I would not have the faith I have today." And that's exactly how I feel. I started questioning things back in 2016. And so I don't think deconstruction, I know that authors such as Brian McLaren and others had used the term deconstruction to talk about these sort of faith transitions before then, but I hadn't read any of their books at that point. And so I didn't have access to that phrase immediately. The first phrase that I ran across was from Richard Rohr, where he says order, disorder, and then reorder. And so thankfully, from early on when I started to question things and try to reconstruct my faith, I was never left with this singular word, deconstruction. There was always that word reorder that was at the end of the process. And so to me, even going into it, when I started to rethink, it wasn't like I was deconstructing and not reconstructing something in its place, but I knew that on the other side of disorder was a time of reordering. And so I'm glad that I got that language early on. But unfortunately, a lot of pastors, and maybe I know it's more than social media, but maybe it's just more so on social media, when they see that word deconstruction, they don't know that the word reorder is on, or reconstruction is on the other side of that. They just see deconstruction in a negative light.
Walter Brueggemann? Do you read Walter Brueggemann?
Yes, sir. I'm using one of his books for a minor prophets class I'm teaching right now.
He talks about orientation,
that's right,
disorientation, and reorientation.
That's right.
And
I've heard
that's
that one
a
too.
similar thing. I have not heard this about Richard Rohr, using the idea of order, disorder, and reorder.
Yes, sir.
That's good. Yeah.
Brad Jerzak put out a book a couple years ago. I think it was 2021, maybe 2022. It was on Deconstruction. I wish I could remember the title of that book. It's probably on the shelf behind me if I were to turn around and look. But he catalogs several different groups of phrases people use to talk about this process. I know one of them was simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and then harmony. That was Brian McLaren's, and then disorder or order, disorder, and reorder, and then deconstruction and reconstruction. But there's been several iterations of that phrase, and I liked yours that you used in your book. Was it? You'll have to coach me on it exactly, but it was something to the effect of liminal spaces, and then
liminality.
That's right.
Elimination, and then liberation.
Okay. That's right.
Yeah,
I like that.
There is no word elimination. We call it, it's liminality, but it's entering into a phase of. I don't know what the first state would be. Safety or something like that. But then entering into liminality is where people aren't sure where they are. They're in between. And they go through a process of elimination before they can find liberation.
It was, it's helpful to me to think about this process not as just a step ladder. Like once you go up the ladder, you've reached the top, then you're done. But as more of a spiral, or as more of a seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter, because there's been several periods of liminality in my own life where I wake up in the morning and I'm going, well, wait a minute, what am I doing here, or what's next, or what's on the other side of this? And
what was Jerzek's again? Simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and
that was McLaren's. Let me see here. I know I have his book. Oh, it's called, here we go. Here's his book here. Out of the Embers, Faith After the Great Deconstruction. Yeah. And I think it's in the introduction to that book that he...
What was the final one?
Harmony.
Harmony, yeah.
Harmony. Here we go. It's... St. John of the Cross was purgation, illumination, then union. J.R.R. Tolkien's enchantment, disenchantment, reenchantment. And then Richard Rohr, order, disorder, reorder. And then I already told you Brian McLaren's. And then, let's see, there's one here, theism, atheism, and anatheism. So, well, there you go.
Yeah.
I appreciate the discussion there. Let's see.
These are good ways of talking about the experience of what people go through. I want to divorce it from simply being individualistic, because that initial phase, however you describe it, orientation, order, simplicity, is connected to community.
That's right.
And it's your church, it's your people. And so the entering into liminality is what we call it in Invisible Jesus, disrupts the relationships with people in the church, and sometimes we know it's disrupted and we have to keep silent because we don't believe it. And we know if we say it, we're going to be in trouble and get eliminated. And a lot of people who are leaders in the church live in liminality for a long time in order to preserve their sanity, their income, their friendships. But over time, this really begins to weaken a sense of faith. And it's too bad that churches don't create more safety for people so that they can think out loud. I've been in institutions that don't allow you to think outside the box, and I've been in institutions that do. Been in church settings, and it's healthier to be able to think.
It is. I was having one of our members was messaging me the other day, and they're reading through the book of Matthew, and they were going, wait a minute, I don't know why I've never noticed this before, but did was Jesus in Nazareth or was he in Bethlehem? And how long was he in Bethlehem? And when did this whole thing with, uh, the genocide or the infanticide there in Bethlehem, when did that happen? And how does that correspond with Luke? Because when Jesus was 8 days old, he was taken to the temple and all this. And I just thought, I'm so glad that you feel like you have the freedom to ask me these questions, because I know
Yeah.
I wouldn't have been able to ask these questions to my
Yeah. Yeah.
to my minister, at least in a way that wouldn't receive maybe some shock and maybe an emergency meeting with my family or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, I'm glad that she felt like she had that freedom. What you mentioned there about the freedom to ask questions reminded me of a quote out of a book I was reading just the other day. It was from William Barclay's book on the Apostles' Creed. And he talked there about two different types of tolerance. And I think one thing that comes up in this deconstruction talk a lot is, well, we shouldn't have tolerance, or we shouldn't exhibit tolerance. And I don't know why people feel the need to say this, but I love his idea of the two kinds of tolerance. One tolerance comes from someone who doesn't care. They have no strong beliefs or principles. They don't think the issues matter. They're too mentally or spiritually lazy to take a stand on anything. But then the other kind of tolerance comes from the certainty that God fulfills himself in many ways, and the tolerance which refuses to be arrogant enough to believe that any man has an exclusive grasp on the whole truth. The tolerance which is quite sure that a great many things on the circumference of the faith can be left fluid so long as the center, which is Christ, is right. The tolerance which cannot bring itself to believe that any ecclesiastical system is necessary for salvation. The tolerance which can say, as John Wesley did, "Is your heart as my heart? Then give me your hand." And I think that kind of shows both how deconstructors are being painted as simply not caring or not being grounded in the faith or having that kind of bad kind of that tolerance. But really and truly, most of them, if not all of them, have that other kind where they're going, okay, I know Christ is at the center of the faith, and I want to be patient with people who have disagreements with me, because now I've realized that I don't have all the answers. And I think that's a kind of tolerance that we should all aspire for.
William Barclay.
That's right.
William Barclay. Good for you. He was a great writer.
He was. My grandfather had a copy of some of his commentaries on the New Testament in a library that he loaned out to me before I was eliminated. But I picked up his book on the Apostles' Creed because we don't have a strong connection to the creeds in my tradition. So I'm trying to get as much as I can.
Yeah, good for you.
Thank you, my friend. Another quote that I really appreciated, I think this might have been from Tommy. It was in one of his sections. I'm not sure how you wrote the book together, but whenever he said he made sure to know that it was him. He says, many of them carry the label of agnostic, not because they think God doesn't exist, but because it is how they were raised to describe their current condition of not knowing. And that, I thought that was so impressive, because I've met so many people who are coming out of our particular background, and they're going, I think that I'm an agnostic right now. And it's not that, like you said there, it's not because they don't believe in God. It's just because they don't know what to think. What do you think would be maybe more healthy language for them to use to describe themselves in this season of their life? Or maybe a better way to think about themselves.
Yeah, it just depends who you're talking about. The ones that we were talking about, I don't know if they'd use the word agnostic, but if they did, it would. I like that expression. They're in the condition of not knowing. I would not have used that for my expression my condition when I was in seminary. I used the expression, I knew a lot more about what I didn't believe than what I did believe. So I was sort of incredulity was a little bit of my phase. But if it is a genuine pursuit of truth, and it is the faith-seeking understanding, there are phases when you just have to say, I don't know. And those who are unwilling to admit they don't know are arrogant or deeply mistaken. But it's not good to think you know everything. And so you brought that up. This is why I don't care for John MacArthur. John MacArthur is absolutely confident of everything he thinks and has ever thought. And I don't know that he's changed his mind on anything.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that this is the proper approach of a human being toward knowledge of God, is that God is so much more vast than we are. Even Scripture is more vast than what we know. I mean, how many people really know Jeremiah or Ezekiel well? And really, and I don't mean just they've read it. I mean understand the complexities of what's going on in these texts.
Right.
So I think that not knowing that's a way of describing, that's what agnostic means. But if it means I'm a total agnostic, that's not as healthy as
Right.
I'm agnostic about certain things. And that's okay. It's probably not language you should use from behind, as you say, the pulpit. I say
That's
pulpit.
That's another one of those P's. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So I like that. I like what you read there. And Tommy, some of them would say they're agnostic because they're just not. They're in liminality. They're disoriented.
A lot of the people he was talking about were given two options. You either believe in this 6,000-year-old Earth and you can have faith in Christ then, or if you throw out the 6,000-year-old Earth, you also have to throw out faith in Christ. Because if you can't trust Genesis 1, how could you trust Matthew 28?
I grew up with that.
That's what I was taught as well. And I've got books on my shelf from that phase of my life that I could not fathom giving to a teenager today. I mean that.
Oh, I know. When I was a sophomore in college, maybe a junior. Francis Schaeffer came out with a book, I think, called Genesis in Space and Time. And I remember reading that he thought the Earth was 20,000 years old. Something like that. And I went, I better not tell anybody that I'm reading this kind of book. Well, it wasn't long after that a guy published a book with InterVarsity talking about micro versus macro evolution. And then I was really on the downward slope for these people. But those are the things that people struggle with.
One of the passages that came to my mind as you were talking a while ago was 1 Corinthians 8, verses 2 and 3, where he says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God is known by him. And that passage was so freeing to me because it basically described me exactly. If anyone thinks that he knows anything, he does not yet know as he ought to know. And that came to my mind as you were talking, because it seems as if that kind of healthy agnosticism, to use Tommy's word there, would actually describe the mature Christian from Paul's perspective, admitting that you don't yet have all the answers, or you don't know everything as you might think that you ought to. But let's I know we're coming kind of close to the end here of our 45 minutes together, but let's focus on one of these questions that were sent over by your publisher. They put here, what is your word to Christians who have serious concerns about the health and focus of their local churches?
Of their local churches?
Yes, sir.
Not the deconstructors, but of the healthy. I mean, we think that we believe that churches ought to reorient themselves around Jesus. I mean, that's a pretty simple answer, but that's pretty profound.
Yeah, we were having that discussion in our Tuesday morning Bible class just yesterday about how so many of our issues that we talk about seem to lose their existential urgency when we realize that Jesus is at the center of it all.
Yeah.
I mean, if you begin to grasp the idea as expressed in John 17, that God loves you with the same duration, intensity, and quality that he loves the Son, from before the foundation of the earth, then that makes a whole lot of these things that we fight about and argue about seem just
Yeah.
so small
Yeah.
in comparison.
I mean, First John talks about is like loving God is the ultimate form of knowing God. Those who love God know God.
Yeah.
Knowledge and love should not be disconnected. There's a book called by a person last name of Meek, Loving to Know. I got to tell you, I haven't read it, but I've read about it and I bought it. But by the time it arrived, I couldn't use it for something I was writing. So I haven't been able to get back to it. But when epistemology is connected to love and agape, you're getting close to what God knows.
There's a rabbit that's just ran across the trail, and I want to chase it really badly. But in 1 Corinthians 13, I think I was raised with the idea that which is perfect was in reference to the New Testament canon, and that whenever the canon was completed, then the miracles passed away or whatever. But I've come to see more recently that which is perfect seems to be the full revelation of God, not through information, but through love. And that when we love God, when we truly love God, then all of our arguments about prophecies and tongues and knowledge vanish away, and we come to know fully as we have been fully known, kind of as John expresses in First John. And I think First Corinthians 13 is probably the clearest link between the common hope of Paul's eschatology and John's eschatology, because they're both rooted in the full revelation, not just in reality, but also in perception of the love of God. As the love of God was fully manifested on the cross, but as we grow up in all things in Him, that love becomes fully realized, and we come to that face-to-face relationship with God, which seems to be the hope of the eschatological hope of Paul and the other New Testament writers. And I think that's related to our discussion on deconstruction, because a lot of what's being deconstructed is these things that distract from this main thing, which is to love God to love God and to be fully known by Him. So, I don't know if that made any sense at all, but
that was good. That was good. No, I totally agree.
Yeah. I think so much is missed. Yeah. And a lot of the things that people deconstruct are some of these. Now I know a lot of it's issues of justice and issues of hypocrisy and things like that. But people that come from my world, where to us a liberal was someone who used instruments, or in your case, a liberal was someone who held to a different view on the rapture. You have to work through a lot of denominational disputes before you get to the heavy hitting stuff, and a lot of that seems to just fall, basically just become not important or not as big of a deal or whatever you want to say when you come face to face with ultimate love as expressed through Jesus. Do you have any reaction to that here? I know that.
No, I agree with you, and I think that the deepest form of knowing is loving.
Yeah.
And I know my wife Chris because I love her, not because I have propositions about her.
Exactly. Well, my brother, I appreciate you so much
thank you
for joining me here. I appreciate your time. You said you've done 400 podcasts in the last, 2 weeks or something?
3 years. 3 years.
3 years. Okay, I was close.
Yeah. I got another one. I've got another one here in 10 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll let you go ahead and get prepared for that. But I know that a lot of my audience appreciates your work. They've read, I've heard specifically, besides the Second Testament, someone was saying that they were reading Revelation for the rest of us here this week, and he was looking at getting.
See this shoulder.
what was the book on? A New Vision for Israel. I think it's on my eschatology
Yeah,
shelf over there.
that's a book I wrote in 1999 on the teaching vision of Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got that one over there. And then the King Jesus Gospel is one a lot of my
Yeah.
audience read recently. And then A Blue Parakeet was another
Yeah.
formative book for us. We're working through some of those ideas as a congregation now, so be praying for us on that.
Thank you.
That
I
we'll
will
fully
be.
realize what the word "and" means in Joel chapter 2, sons and daughters. So that's a tough word, but we're
Yeah.
working on it. But
Yeah.
brother, again, thank you. Would you like to close us with a blessing or just a word of encouragement before we
Yeah.
go?
Yeah, I think the Lord blesses those who turn their face to him, as in Numbers 6, and the Lord looks upon us. And I pray that the Lord will look upon you and your congregation, your preaching ministry, that people will then turn their face toward Jesus and gaze upon the Son of God and gain a deeper vision for life for themselves.
Amen. Thank you, brother.